So we come now to item number 9 on the agenda, which is the significance and engagement policy. I'll move that. Ask for a seconder for the policy.
I'll second Kirk.
The recommendations. Thank you. You will see that I have made a change in the recommendations from the position of chair, and that is to reinstate as a strategic asset freehold interests in the Central Auckland waterfront land and shares in our substantive CCOs. That's Watercare, Auckland Transport, Auckland Unlimited, and Eke Panuku. And I've really done that because I think the perception of removing those from the list of strategic assets would send the wrong message to the public. We have no intention of selling our waterfront land. We have no intention of selling shares in our substantive council-controlled organisations. The net impact of putting them back in is that there is a set consultation process that needs to be followed, which is the status quo. It is a rather complex policy, but on balance, I believe that it would be wrong to create the perception that somehow we were intending to sell either of those two assets. But with that, I'll ask. I think it's Justine and Eddie. Justine, you and Eddie Tuiavi as leading in this paper, if they have comments to make, or it may be somebody else. So,
Your Worship, Kenneth Albertier here. I can talk briefly.
Thank you. Thank you. That'd be good.
With the help of Eddie and Justine and Ross. So, we're asking, obviously, that the governing body consider the proposed changes to the significance and engagement policy and adopt the policy. But to provide some brief context before I pass it over to Eddie, the policy, broadly speaking, outlines Auckland Council's commitment to engage Aucklanders and how we will go about providing opportunities for Aucklanders to participate in local government decision-making. The policy has been through a refresh process to ensure it evolves and remains relevant, given a range of shifts and changes across Tamaki Makaurau since it was first adopted in 2014. As a result, there have been several refinements to the policy that will help ensure Council can respond to a range of factors, including Auckland's growing population, the increased diversity, the impact of digital technology, and now, as you'll all be aware, the pandemic. We also recognise on the engagement side of the policy that the biggest opportunities to enhance our engagement offering is how we continue to modify the delivery of operational engagement, which is a program of work Eddie Tuiavi, who is the Principal Advisor for Democracy Engagement, is leading. Just on that point, though, it's a good segue into passing it over to Eddie, who'll talk about some of the specific refinements in the engagement section and how we enable stakeholders to participate in the refreshed process. Over to you, Eddie.
Tēnā rawa te koe, Liman Manu. I'll speak a little bit about the engagement process and then go into these engagement updates. The engagement process saw the consultation run across 3 weeks, starting September 20th until October 18th, 2021. You'll recall that this was during lockdown. This resulted in about 420 pieces of feedback, both from online engagement and through our community partnerships. Before, during, after the consultation process, the formal consultation process, conversations were and are still ongoing across the organisation and externally regarding not only the policy but also the guidelines for a number of reasons, including but not limited to, well, number one, it's about exemplifying good engagement, so it must be ongoing. Also, it's about a commitment to working with our communities. Finally, I guess the commitment to strong relationships with mana whenua and Matawaka remains strong, with ongoing dialogue between the IMSB Secretariat and our ngā mātaurei whānau. You will have heard Aliman Manu Kenneth speak about the next phase of this refresh, which will see the engagement guidelines reviewed, for which a composite oversight committee comprised of a mix of representatives from across the business, including mana whenua and Matawaka. This will be quite a substantial piece of work, It'll commence in Q4, and I know that you'll agree with me. It really gives a lot of kudos and mana to the policy by relooking at our engagement guidelines. 3 quick points to make from an engagement perspective. The overall amendments were made to allow for more user-friendly language. Alitman Manu Kenneth has alluded to it. The last time it was looked at was the last time it was written, which was in 2014. Number 2, engagement principles were refreshed to reflect a more diverse or changing Tāmaki Makaurau. That's quite self-explanatory. 3, you'll all be acutely aware, because all of you had something to say about it, safety. The safety of elected members of Te Kaunihera or Tāmaki Makaurau Kaimahi or staff, and also of the community when engaging or being consulted on. You'll see this in section 5.1 of the draft policy, which is before you, safety of elected members, community, and also Auckland Council staff. I'd now like to hand across to my colleague, Justine.
Thanks, Eddie. So overall, we received really positive feedback from both our public consultation and our engagement with the local boards. Almost 75% of submitters during our public consultation, 74 to be exact, agreed with our proposed policy refresh changes. And the most common theme that came through during public consultation feedback was mostly around our proposed change of the simplification of language in the policy that Eddie has alluded to. And this was a global change that we decided to make for the 2022 policy. As you've heard just now, the 2014 policy, while mostly fit for purpose and user-friendly, it did rely on a lot of technical or esoteric jargon that for 2022, we wanted to make sure that we moved away from that. And so for 2022, we proposed really a more simplified approach to the way that we've presented our information, for the purpose that any member of Auckland Council staff or any member of the public can pick up this policy document and understand where we're coming from. So this is similar to local board consultation as well, where our local boards were also mostly supportive of our proposed policy changes in terms of both the significance and the engagement aspects. Some areas of feedback and questions that did come through during our local board workshops and subsequent resolutions were, number 1, in regard to the role that local boards play in terms of decision making for issues, proposals, decisions, or matters in their specific local board area. And number 2, just in regards to the overall approach to strategic assets. So while these are all covered in detail in the report, I will pass it off to Ross Tucker now to give us some more background.
Okay, thank you, Justine. As Justine's talked about, the part of the policy refresh was to make things clearer for members of the public. We also try to make things, clearer for lawyers by clarifying some elements of the policy, remove any ambiguity, and make things more closely aligned with the Local Government Act and the intention of the Local Government Act. So, in the significance part of the policy, a key change is to talk about significance as a spectrum. So rather than is it significant or is it not significant, it's more a question of how significant is it. Also looking at, well, how do assets work as a group? What is the cumulative impact of changes? So it's kind of taking that view around putting services at the forefront and going, well, what are the services council needs to provide, and then what assets do we need to own or control to achieve that? And when we're making decisions, how impactful is that on the council's ability to deliver services? So that's kind of the essence of the policy. As part of that, there was a review of the list of strategic assets to keep things, to make sure that we've got things at that right level about services. The impact of having something in the policy defined as a strategic asset means that to make any changes to ownership or control, even minor changes, it requires a full audited LTP amendment process. So that can be a long, time-consuming, expensive process. And what we've found in practice over recent years is it's not always fit for purpose. It doesn't always get as much public feedback as we would like. So we had some amendments related to strategic assets in the last long-term plan, and some of the proposals had sort of less than 20 feedback points. And I think that is partly because it's characterised by proposals that are long and complex, have lots of financials, and that's necessary to meet audit requirements. Whereas, in fact, what might have been more fit for purpose is explaining things in simple terms, reaching out in different ways to the people most interested. And so what the policy tries to do is enable more fit for purpose consultation for some of our assets. So what we propose to do here is refine the list of strategic assets to keep it at that high level. What are the core things we need to own to deliver basic services, and then add to the way the policy framework works a set of guidelines that talks about other assets and how do we assess the degree of significance and what appropriate public consultation looks like for different categories of assets. And so what that does, that allows us to have a more fit for purpose engagement. It means perhaps a bigger role for local boards, a more engagement with the communities or interest groups that are most interested in a particular topic. So it's not about saying some assets are less important. It's about saying, let's have a fit for purpose consultation approach. And I think through this change, what we probably see is more assets covered by consultation requirements, but we'll see perhaps a bit less of lengthy, inappropriate, cumbersome LTB amendment processes when that's not necessary. I guess it is important to note that with the changes around strategic assets, and the changes to significance, none of this changes delegations or the authority given to staff. So there's nothing in this policy change that gives staff or Panuku or anybody else any rights to go away and make changes. The decisions will be made by yourselves or by local boards where that happens at the moment. So none of this changes decision-making allocations. It's about how we engage. So it's about So that's the intention. We are seeing some changes, and there's been some feedback from local boards about particular items. We think this policy is more appropriate, more aligned with legislation, and that through those through those guidelines around other assets, we can achieve better consultation and engagement outcomes. Thank you. So, am I passing back to Kenneth? Did you want to wrap up, or are we happy to take questions from there?
I think we're happy to take questions at this point, Ross.
Okay. Well, thank you, Kenneth, Ross, Eddie and Justine. That was a pretty full account. Just for the sake of completeness, also to congratulate Shane and Brooke on getting married next weekend. And we hope that I think it'll be third time lucky in terms of having to postpone, Shane. So congratulations. Must be something in the drinking water and on council at the moment, all of these marriages at once. Right. So we have some questions. We'll have questions first and then any comment. And the first question is from Councillor Angela Dalton. Angela.
Thank you, Your Worship. And look, I support the recommendations and thank you for all of the work that's being done on this policy. Mine is just a curiosity, really. I had a look at the demographics of the returns and I noticed that 30% were from 15 to 24-year-olds and 84% was from our Asian community. And I just wondered, was there a particular channel that returned those high percentages?
I'm happy to speak to that through Your Worship.
Thanks, Eddie. Please go ahead.
Tēnā te koe, Councillor for the Pātai. You'll be aware that this was conducted during lockdown. We have quite a substantial list of community partners and we reached out to all of them. And essentially, although, this topic, this kaupapa is incredibly important to everybody, not everybody had the bandwidth to come back. And so these were the community partners that came back and they reached out. Long story short, the channels that they used, Councillor, were quite modern. There was a lot of digital engagement. There was a lot of WhatsApp. There was a lot of WeChat. So going forward, I would love to look to harness those kinds of methods and those kinds of platforms for when we do the actual guideline refresh. But that's pretty much the short of it. Aliman Manu Kenneth, was there anything you wanted to add to that response?
Thank you, Taito Eddie. I think you hit the nail on the head. The challenge for us, or the opportunity for us as council's engagement practitioners, is to ensure that we're providing fit for purpose channels for people to provide feedback. And that means ensuring that our toolbox of channels continues to grow, whether it's face-to-face, whether it's digital, whether it's through mail. We just need to know that not one channel is going to be good for any one population, not to make assumptions. So while we are in a pandemic situation and digital is our main channel to receive feedback, we absolutely stand by the need to continue to have the other channels available when and where they are feasible to apply. That's all I'd add to the comments from my colleague, Taito Eddie. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Kenneth and Eddie. Sorry, Your Worship.
Yep, go ahead.
It just shows the power, doesn't it, of those social media channels, and I think WeChat might have worked really well in this instance. But thank you for all the work you're doing. Hopefully, lockdown has encouraged more and more online behaviour, and that will help us. So thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Dalton. Next question is Councillor Shane Henderson.
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, it's really interesting feedback here, and I really enjoyed the local board feedback in particular. Was really valuable. Just wanted to pick up on one point from the Henderson Massey local board, who raised the possibility of social media being used as valid feedback that we can use for future engagement. So I'm just wondering where our policy squares with that. Is there any relevance there? And I'd kind of like to know a bit more. So thank you.
Thank you for the question, Councillor. So social media obviously is a very important tool within our arsenal, particularly in terms of pushing our messages out or for external communications. In terms of its use or application as a way of receiving feedback, it is something that we've tried before, but we are aware of also the constraints or limitations in terms of accepting social media feedback through text, for example, because of the limited characters that people can use to provide the responses. However, as you say, and the fact that we're not necessarily able to collect demographic profile data to ensure that we know who's responding or which segments or audiences across the Auckland population are participating. But that doesn't mean that we don't want to continue to look or explore that as an option. I guess it's just making sure that when we do use social media channels to receive the feedback, that we're very realistic as to how we treat that data, what constraints we're operating under, given, as I mentioned, some of the characteristics of using social media channels, which differs from other channels that we have available. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just a reminder from Sandra, appropriately, about the use of the chat bar, though I did smile at Josephine's comment. Next question is Councillor Wayne Walker.
Sure. Got a question, and it goes to the retention of the Central Auckland waterfront land, and I don't have any issue with that. I'm entirely supportive. But my question is around the other waterfront land that the council owns, which is not necessarily in the CBD, but in locations like Gulf Harbour and West Harbour, and particularly marinas, where in a similar principled fashion to the waterfront land, these areas are reclaimed. In the instances that I indicate, they're also covered off by Acts of Parliament that identify them under empowering acts and identify continued right of public access, boat harbour purposes, other restrictions. So my question is around whether the same principles that apply to the Central Auckland waterfront land can apply to other areas of waterfront land that might be as important, as strategic as the waterfront land, particularly into the future as we move into a need for far more resilience, consideration of climate change, the coastal policy statement, and so on. So has there been some consideration given to the other waterfront land around Auckland?
So in forming the policy, we had a look at those other kind of waterfront lands, marinas, etc., and we thought the better way to approach that is through the engagements, the engagement guidelines we're going to prepare around non-strategic assets. We think that it's about having fit-for-purpose consultation. So we think for those kind of assets, an audited LTP amendment isn't the right kind of process that would be required if it was a strategic asset. And we think it might be better to have engagement with special interest groups, engagement with the local community, engagement through the local board. So we see there's other ways to make sure that engagement happens in a more fit-for-purpose way.
Okay, just a supplementary question. I mean, is it conceivable, for example, that while an area of waterfront land that, let's say, a given marina by itself might not be considered sufficiently strategic. As a grouping, as a network, they may well be highly strategic. And I guess the test for me is in an instance where they were sold or an area was put into private ownership, which was going to be the case at West Harbour, and there happened to be an event that occurred at a later point where there was a strategic requirement for that area, would not that test apply? And I think increasingly we live in times where there is a vital need to foresight, to backcast, to identify things that may well happen that may not identify something as strategic at this point in time, but could be highly strategic later. So are we giving those matters, that is more of a network, a foresighting approach, consideration when it comes to strategic assets and consultation? Thanks.
So I think in the updated policy, what it does is it talks about, rather than things being, significant or not significant, it's about a spectrum. So how significant it could be. So it might be something that is, a marina that affects the local community might have, the guidelines might say consult with that community. If it's a change to, waterfront land across the region, it might mean region-wide consultation is appropriate. Because the policy talks about degrees of significance, that can change over time. So I think when a decision was proposed, if you were considering, if the council was considering some change, you would consider all the factors at that point in time, and it might be something that is, perhaps, not highly significant now, at some point in the future could become highly significant. I would just note in terms of, the public transport network is one of the strategic assets. So if something was going to so fundamentally change how ferries were to operate, for example, that would trigger LTP amendment requirements in terms of the public transport network being on the list of strategic assets.
Thank you. Next question, Councillor Affessel-Collins. Mic on. Thank you.
Thanks, Mayor. Sorry, I was coming out of the Nexus page. Just two questions from me, and they're both in relation to consultation. The first is point 51 talks about the ongoing collaboration with Māori and our partners there. I was just wondering if I could get a bit more of an understanding of what is meant by that. And the second one was in the policy, and you might have some thoughts on this, Limani Manu, and we can talk about it later, but it talks in 5.9 of the actual policy of using plain language, and it's within the kind of that's after 5.8 where it talks about the diversity panels and all of that. So you'll know where I'm going with the question. When we say use plain language, I'm guessing we're saying use plain English language, which is kind of policy driven with us at council. Will we ever get to the point where we're going to be saying for specific communities we will use Korean rather than just use plain language? Because there will be certain communities that we were trying to really reach them. And I'm interested to see if we're going to use we still seem to be benchmarking off English. I don't know if I even understand my question, but I hope you kind of get some ideas.
Through the chair, thank you for the question, Councillor Whanana. So I'll start with your first question. We are absolutely committed to ensuring that we are able to communicate with all of Auckland's communities. Obviously, we need to go about this in a pragmatic way. So you will notice with our annual budget consultations and our more statutory consultations that are regional, we look at the 5 most spoken languages in Auckland and start there and look at how we can summarise the information in a way that allows us to maintain cost efficiency, but still provide some information in a language that other than English. So Korean, Chinese, Tongan Samoan, for example, and obviously Te Reo. That's something obviously that we want to grow over time. If we are, as I steadfastly committed to, wanting to become more and more inclusive in the way that we approach Aucklanders and acknowledge that there are other languages. But let's also accept the fact that English is still the main language that is spoken. So over time, while we will look to adopt new ways of communicating and take into account different languages more and more, where we're keeping with the language that we know is most spoken first and foremost, but absolutely committed to knowing that as Auckland evolves, the languages evolve and more languages come into play, we need to show that our engagement approach is staying up with the times. So that's something that we'll look at with the operational guideline work that Taito Eri Tuivi is doing to see what is the intention over the next short to medium term to show that we are looking at other languages in a more prevalent way other than what we've started at the moment. But perhaps just as a side comment to that, one of the things that we're also looking to push that we're really excited about is that Council has developed a panel of staff across the organisation who speak other languages other than English to assist with that process in a way that also acknowledges or provides some level of remuneration for that cultural proficiency that they're bringing to the table to assist Council in the way that we engage Aucklanders. This has started with the Auckland annual budget consultation, and it's a way of us recognising the skills and talents that people who come from other parts of Auckland or other cultures can contribute to our overall effort to engage Aucklanders more effectively. In terms of your first question, I think Eddie can start there and I'll probably continue, but we are doing some great work in the Mata in that space. Over to you, Eddie.
Through the chair, Lila Mayava Phil. Whanana, your question around what this looks like is a really important one. It's important for us officers so we're not coming and giving you a lovely spiel and then have no idea what that looks like in practice. What it does look like in practice, Councillor Whanana, is, Te Kaunihira o Tamaki Makoto is committed to positive and productive relationships with Māori. What does that then look like the next level down? Well, what it looks like is before we went out to consult, we were talking with the Secretariat at IMSB. We were talking with Ngā Mātarai. We were talking across our Matawaka groups that we work with. Post-consultation, thinking about the engagement guidelines, the process remains the same. Before we put pen to paper, that ongoing relationship tells me that I need to wander down to IMSB and chat to them. We also have Councillor Dalton on the call, Māori Portfolio. We have our groups that we work with. It looks like before pen is put to paper, we're scoping, we're making sure that we're aware. And what we're really trying to avoid there, Councillor Collins, is the cult of the expert, where a council officer thinks what they think and then they go out and consult on that. It means that before we do anything or make such decisions, in addition to all the stakeholder groups that Aliman Manu Kenneth has spoken to, it's about going to Māori first before we do anything, rather than going with a finished policy or project or guidelines and saying, would you please just sign off on this? So it just means that we're going out to them earlier, Councillor Collins, and we're making a more concerted effort to involving them earlier on in the process.
Thank you very much. Next question is Councillor Chris Darby.
Thank you, Mayor, and thanks, team. Just on the amendments proposed here, on the Roman 1, it reads freehold interests in the Auckland Central Waterfront land. Is there a definition somewhere of Auckland waterfront land, what it includes and what it doesn't? That's the first part of my question. And I'm also just wondering why it's freehold interests, because that may not cover a long-term lease offered. Say a 100-year lease would be offered. We still hold freehold, but you've lost control. So who might address that one? And the second part to that question is, what is Panuku's feedback to that proposed amendment? That's my first question.
Okay. The reason why it's in the amendment is because on the column on page 46, it refers to freehold interests in central Auckland waterfront land. So that's presumably how it's been described in the past. But is there any, Ross, can you or somebody else help us with the answer to Councillor Darby's question?
Yeah, I think that's right. It's there. Historically, that's how it's been described. It's been in there, that kind of wording for a decade or so. I think it relates to the land under the control of the Waterfront Development Agency, when that was established at the start of Auckland Council. In terms of the question around leasehold versus freehold, so the way that this is operated, in the past is that if whenever Panuku are entering into a lease transaction, they have to go through an LTP amendment process. We've had to undertake LTP consultation, and there was a package of those in the last LTP. Very little feedback received through that process, but it does mean every time there's a long-term lease on a development site, we need to go through a complex LTP amendment process to give effect to that lease, because it is changing the control of that land.
Okay, so what I'm hearing, so what I'm hearing is
change was to remove that requirement, to create and use more guidelines. So we've got a different approach to consulting on changes, but the recommendation here would mean that we continue the status quo.
Okay, so you're assuring us that we're well covered there. There's not just a limit on a freehold transaction. Okay, the second question, maybe this is for Ross or even the Chief Executive. Is there a forthcoming report confirmed that identifies, presents, what our strategic outcomes might be for strategic assets? Now, some of the strategic assets that is somewhat identified, not in a lot of detail. We did discuss this, I think it was late last year. So either for you, Ross, or the Chief Executive, are we likely to see a report that considers the strategic outcomes that the council identifies of its strategic assets?
Thanks, Councillor Darby. The work to identify strategic outcomes across such a broad spectrum of assets would be quite difficult and complex to do and take a long time. However, we did agree to and have commissioned a piece of work for council officers to start the process of identifying our strategic outcomes for the ports of Auckland. That being, one obviously of the very important strategic assets in our portfolio. We do anticipate bringing that work back to council during the course of the year. I don't have in my mind at the moment the specific timeline for that, but we are focused on that question that you've raised, not broadly, but specifically in relation to the ports of Auckland. We could, I'm speculating here, we could, of course, use that framework more broadly to consider strategic outcomes for other assets, but I think it's important to get the framework around that right first, and we're going to start on that with the ports of Auckland.
Would it not, Mr. Chief Executive, would it not be prudent to apply that to the other big asset of, the $2 billion stake in the airport, where we don't have any strategic outcomes identified, just like the Port of Auckland, which is another multi-billion-dollar investment? And I agree with you. Look, rather than look at every strategic asset in all classes, but in that framework to confirm the strategic outcomes for at least those two big assets of port and airport.
Yeah, so I think that is a decision that we or you could make. That's not currently the scope of the work that we're doing. I would say, without preempting the outcome, it is possible, of course, that the strategic outcomes, or the way that we think about strategic outcomes, could be quite different for the port compared to the airport. And we did have as everyone will recall, we've had a number of conversations about the airport through both the long-term plan and the annual plan process. We've arrived at at least for now, that's not the priority in terms of our strategic outcomes focus, at least in the very short term, although it could be a candidate for evaluation within the same sorts of framework as we're developing for the ports of Auckland. The work that we're doing in relation to the ports of Auckland is being supported by some advisory work that we've got, some advisors we've got working with us who specialise in ports, have less expertise in airports, but we anticipate we might be able to use a similar framework and extend it once we've worked on the framework as it relates to the strategic outcomes for the port. I note the question that you raised, and I think, and I won't be surprised if when we come back to talk about the port that, we would be asked that question again.
Okay. Look, this is an interesting discussion, and it's at a tangent a little bit to what we're doing today, but there is a paper coming back on that, and we'll be discussing that issue in its own right when our officers report back to us. Last question is in the name of Councillor John Watson.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Mayor. My question goes to the policy, and particularly in light of Ross's comment about making things clearer to the public. Certainly, this is a question that's come back to me through a number of channels, and it goes to the distinction that's drawn between the groups of assets being considered as a network, and I'm looking at Auckland strategic assets here that we've got a register of, and where we would consider groups of assets or network as a whole, as opposed to individual assets within that group. Now that might be all fine and well for some of these bigger networks, but some of the smaller ones, just for example, say the network of stadiums, for instance, if we took that as an example. Clearly, if you have a network that is made up of 2 or 3 things, big assets, if you take one out, but by definition you almost don't have a network anymore. So my question at the end of all this is, and it can apply to some of the other the networks of parks and open spaces, for instance, in a particular region or even community facilities, the kind of explanation there to me seems a little subjective in terms of the evaluation that may or may not be made as to whether you're affecting the network as a whole. So I'd invite your comment on that, Ross, and I would just appreciate the clarification that in any case, when it comes to strategic assets and whether the network is affected as a whole, that will be a decision of elected members, of course, in the normal fashion. Is that right?
Yes, I think that's essentially right. So what we're saying here is that we need to think about, what is the service being provided by that network, and does a change that's being proposed to that network, does it change, the function of it? Does it change the service that's being delivered? So if it was, say a network of stadiums, and it was, a change to one of 3, for example, but if you looked at it as a network, it was a significant change overall. You'd have to, look at it from that lens. But what we're saying is it doesn't mean, any change to any asset anywhere in the network isn't by itself significant. You think about, what is the function? What are we trying to achieve with that network? And has the fundamental underlying service changed? It does. We are clear in the policy, and it's required by legislation. We must consider degree of significance on a case-by-case basis. So there's guidance in there, but you'd have to consider, depending on the decision that you were contemplating and its circumstances, well, what is it on a case-by-case basis? How significant is that decision? To what extent are we having a significant change to that network of assets?
Okay, thanks. Just reserve my right to make a brief comment on this, Mr. Mayor, too. Thank you.
Yeah, it's absolutely correct to say that no decisions on sale of any significant asset will be made other than through this body, and that's fundamental. And if it's a significant asset, obviously that would be subject to a consultation process. Right, so we come now for comments, if there are any. Councillor Watson, maybe you'd like to just lead off, and if you've got a brief comment you'd like to make, and if anybody else, please indicate in the sidebar. Councillor Watson.
Thanks very much, Mr. Mayor. I'd just like to very briefly pick up on the section on item attachment A, item 9, which I think appears on page 11, and it goes to the comment which, generalised as it is, does have some real merit, I think, and that's quite simply the remark that this is enabling the voice of the community, not making irrevocable decisions on assets before engaging with the affected community and enabling them to make their view heard. Now, I think there can be a little danger in this where things are at such a high level that we don't draw upon real life examples, and that's what I'd like to just very quickly do here, that really serves to emphasise the importance of this remark in the policy. It was only a few years ago that there was proposals to sell two marinas, essentially Gulf Harbour and West Park Marina, which weren't under the classification of strategic assets. They were part of a network, but that didn't seem to make too much difference either. And for a fairly crucial part of that time, there was no intention to enable the voice of the community in terms of consultation. So it actually required the community, at least in both instances really, to essentially force the council into communicating with them in the sense of a formal engagement process. Now, it was not through the long-term plan. It was more focused on the individual community, as we've heard some reference through today. But in the case of Gulf Harbour, for instance, it was actually the community who, through their knowledge and expertise built up over a number of years, who rejected the proposal that the council was dealing with at that time, which was to sell the marina, the freehold interest in the marina, as part of an exchange for a piece of land known as a hammerhead. Now, as a consequence of that engagement with the community, which I hasten to add was unanimous, so there was 3 very largely attended meetings, there was a unanimous point of view. The end result of that, without prolonging matters, was that council, by following the lead of the community, didn't have to sell the marina, i.e. we retain ownership of the marina now. We secured the hammerhead land, and including the strategic transport network of the ferry service, and the net income to council in terms of the proceeds from essentially buying out the long-term lease were the same as what was being proposed for the sale price. So that form of engagement with the community in that instance, and also to a lesser extent at West Park, produced a far better result for council, and it came as a consequence of enabling the voice of the community, the exact phrase that is used in the policy. So I just finish up, Mr. Mayor, by saying that I hope that phrase is one that is employed. I'm not opposed to fit for purpose consultation, but I am very supportive of enabling that voice of the community, which in instances like that is a voice that adds a lot to the decision and can end up with a much better outcome than might otherwise be the case. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. There are no other comments, so I'll put the motion. All those in favour, please say aye.
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 To the contrary, no. The ayes have it. Thank you very much for that.